Welcome to the Global WarWatch Network, where we pull back the curtain on the forces shaping our world. Today, we're grappling with a truly profound question, one that really cuts to the core of global stability. Is America's era of global dominance truly coming to an end?
Professor Hugh White says yes, and he argues that the world is shifting rapidly toward multipolar power struggles, elevated nuclear risks, and intensifying regional tensions.
From the precarious future of Taiwan to the reevaluation of security in Europe, and from the race for AI to the looming arms races, are America's allies actually ready? Ready to defend themselves in a post-American world, a world where that familiar security blanket might just be pulled away.
It's a vital conversation, really. And we're going to break down the future of global power, the very nature of war, and, well, what it takes to survive in this evolving landscape right now.
Okay, so today we're embarking on a crucial exploration. We're unpacking Professor Hugh White's deep analysis from his 75-page essay, Hard New World, Our Post-American Future. Our mission for you, our listener, is to really explore these profound and, frankly, radical shifts underway in U.S. foreign policy, not just as isolated events, but as part of something much larger, maybe an inevitable global transformation.
Right, and while some might instinctively point to figures like, say, Donald Trump as the singular catalyst for these changes.
Yeah, that's the easy explanation, isn't it?
It is. But Professor White argues these shifts are driven by far deeper long-term forces that have been reshaping the global landscape for decades. This isn't just about a change in administration, it's about the very foundations of international power and how they're fundamentally, well, realigning.
So what's the core argument then, if it's not just Trump?
The core argument here is that the United States is no longer playing that unequivocal leadership role it seemed to inherit so decisively after the Cold War. The fundamental dynamic has shifted quite dramatically. Look, the costs and the risks for the U.S. in maintaining this global leadership, they've escalated massively. And that's happening precisely as its own predominance in national power has, well, waned.
At the same time, you've got rivals rising.
Exactly. Simultaneously, great power rivalry, particularly from a rising China and a resurgent Russia, have intensified significantly. Professor White puts it very succinctly. The arithmetic's against it for the U.S. to sustain this singular unipolar role. This isn't some temporary blip tied to a specific political figure. It's about inevitable, deeper forces that are fundamentally reshaping the international order, forcing a reevaluation of assumptions we've held for a long time.
Now, for many of you listening, particularly if you're, say, of our generation, the idea of the United States playing this singular global role, it feels incredibly normal, almost the natural order of things.
It really does.
Professor White argues this was unusual, almost unprecedented. Can you help us understand just how unusual it was in historical terms?
Absolutely. It's truly like being a fish in water, isn't it? You don't really notice the water or appreciate its unique qualities until it's gone or it changes. This unipolar moment, profoundly unusual in history. Think about it. In the 1990s, at the absolute zenith of this unipolar moment, there was this widespread analogy comparing America's role to, well, the Roman Empire's dominance,
Yeah.
at least across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East during its peak.
Stretching back to ancient Rome, that says something.
It really does. The very fact that people felt they had to stretch back that far to find some kind of comparable analog underscores just how extraordinary this unipolar situation truly was.
So what was the essence of it, this U.S.-led unipolar order?
Well, at its core, this order, which really emerged right at the end of the Cold War, saw the United States both claim and be accorded a unique role in managing the whole international system. This meant defining the rules of international conduct and, crucially, enforcing and upholding those rules everywhere, across the globe.
So judge, jury, and executioner, in a sense.
In a way, yes. America effectively became the sole global great power with no equals, none. The entire international order, from economic frameworks to security alliances, was overwhelmingly framed and shaped by U.S. power, U.S. ideas, and U.S. ideals. It was such a unique moment, it even led to Francis Fukuyama's famous concept of the end of history.
Right, the idea that liberal democracy had won, essentially.
Exactly. The notion that America's triumph marked the end of that long ideological jostling between different ideas and powers. It implied a definitive, maybe even final, path for global governance, rooted in liberal democracy and market capitalism.
And for America's allies, especially in Europe and Asia, this period, it must have felt like the dawn of a golden age, almost the best of all possible worlds, as White puts it.
Oh, absolutely. It was seen as incredibly beneficial, despite, as Professor White notes, the U.S. sometimes doing crazy things, let's be honest.
Yes. A few crazy things.
But for those allies who benefited, it's a world they really wish could have lasted forever. A period of, remarkable stability and prosperity, all under America's security umbrella.
You wouldn't want that.
Precisely.
Yeah.
From their perspective, it offered an unparalleled period of stability, economic integration, a relatively low-cost security environment, and access to the world's largest market. Why wouldn't you want that to endure indefinitely?
So, if this unipolar moment was so exceptional, so beneficial for many, how did the U.S. get there? I mean, after more than a century of 19th century isolationism, how did it become so incredibly active globally after 1914? What was the fundamental strategic shift?
That's a vital question. Because you're right, isolationism in the 19th century wasn't some kind of weird historical mistake. It was actually a very sensible and quite successful policy for the United States at the time.
Why was that?
Well, look at the geography. America was inherently secure.
Yeah.
You had two big, beautiful oceans acting as natural barriers. And maybe more importantly, two friendly and much weaker neighbors in Canada and Mexico.
Right.
Nobody in Washington was losing sleep over an invasion from Ottawa or Mexico City.
Okay, safe neighborhood.
Very safe. And crucially, in the 19th century, Europe's great powers existed in this sophisticated balance of power. You had 5 major players, and they were all basically dedicated to making sure none of the others dominated the continent. As long as that European balance held, America could relax. No single power would get strong enough to project serious force across the Atlantic and threaten the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere.
So Washington could follow his own advice.
Exactly. It allowed the U.S. to heed George Washington's farewell address. Keep the hell out of European political entanglements and focus on its own continental development. Build America first, essentially.
So, ironically, the stability of Europe was the bedrock of American security for over 100 years. But then, like you said, that balance collapsed in 1914, World War I, then again in WWII, and that led to a permanent shift in U.S. foreign policy. How did those conflicts change the game for America?
Precisely. That's exactly what went wrong from the perspective of that old balance, World War I, then World War II, and the Cold War that followed. They were all, in a sense, about the unraveling of that stable European system. See, the 20th century brought rapid economic growth from the Industrial Revolution, plus these extraordinary political developments. Think unification of Germany, for instance.
Big shifts in power.
Huge shifts. It created a new era where there was a very real risk of one power dominating Europe, then maybe all of Eurasia, and becoming powerful enough to actually threaten the United States at home.
And the first big threat was Germany in WWI.
Imperial Germany, yes. After 1917, especially when Russia collapsed in a revolution and dropped out of the war, there was a very real prospect of Germany actually winning and dominating the whole of Eurasia. This wasn't just some abstract fear, this contingency of history. The real possibility of a different, much more dangerous outcome was a very real strategic contingency for the U.S., even if it didn't quite happen in the end.
It could have gone the other way.
Easily. It's easy to look back and think history was inevitable. But in March 1918, German offensives nearly destroyed the Allied forces on the Western Front. Tiny factors, like finally appointing a single Allied commander, made the difference. It just underscores that American involvement wasn't just about ideals. It was driven by these very real strategic contingencies.
And that fear of a dominant Eurasian power continued.
Absolutely. That concern about a potential Eurasian hegemon, first Germany, then later, obviously, the Soviet Union, became unambiguously clear as the Cold War dawned. The Soviet Union, with its immense conventional power and, crucially, its nuclear weapons, posed a tangible threat. American leaders explicitly linked containing the Soviets to U.S. national security. Even Woodrow Wilson's justification for entering World War I, making the world safe for democracy, was deeply tied to the idea that America's own democracy could not be safe if Imperial Germany won. The core motivation really was self-preservation, preventing a hostile power from dominating that huge Eurasian landmass.
Okay, so fast forward to after the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapses. The U.S. takes on this massive global role. But the threat level, conventionally at least, seemed much lower. So what made that post-Cold War global role so appealing? And why did it seem so cheap at the time? Why did America embrace it so readily?
It was really a confluence of factors, a kind of perfect storm, that created this irresistible allure. Firstly, yeah, there was an element of pride. Let's be honest, Americans, like most people, were naturally drawn to the idea of leading the world, being the sole superpower, seeing their values spread.
Felt good.
It felt good. But what truly set this period apart was how very cheap it appeared to be, at least initially. In the 1990s, the U.S. was just overwhelmingly predominant in every dimension of national power. Economic, technological, diplomatic, military, cultural, just seemed absolutely unrivaled, a historical anomaly.
And the world seemed to be going America's way.
That was the conviction, a strong conviction, maybe a bit naive in hindsight. The idea was that the rest of the world, including the most powerful states, largely accepted U.S. leadership and the market democratic model it championed.
Yeah.
Market economics, electoral democracy, rule of law, free press. This model seemed irresistibly on the march, backed by that wave of democratization we saw across Europe, Asia, Africa in the late 80s and early 90s.
Even for potential rivals.
There was even this false hope, as White calls it, for countries like China and Russia. Serious people believed that China was heading towards becoming a democracy, even after Tiananmen Square, and that Russia's transition to democracy was permanent. The thinking was, these countries would accept U.S. leadership, maybe even subordination, for the huge economic opportunities offered by a U.S.-led globalized order. Just like allies, France, Britain, Germany, Japan, South Korea had done.
So leading the world would be easy.
That fostered this walk-in-the-park mentality.
Exactly.
Exercising leadership wasn't seen as this intense geopolitical competition requiring huge sacrifice. No, it was going to be a walk in the park, allowing for a peace dividend. The U.S. could cut defense spending and lead the world simultaneously. From the perspective of Washington elites, why wouldn't you embrace such a seemingly beneficial, low-cost global role? The confidence was palpable, almost intoxicating. Hard not to be, well, seduced by it.
And then there's another crucial factor you mentioned that seemed to disappear after the Cold War, the terror of nuclear war. You argue it's back. How did it fade from our collective strategic thinking, and why is it returning now, making the stakes so much higher?
That's a critical point, and Professor White really hammers this home. During the Cold War, that terror of nuclear war was pervasive, almost an existential part of daily life.
Yeah, MAD, mutually assured destruction.
Right, maybe was grim, but it was understood, a reality. With the end of that era, there was this fundamental psychological shift, maybe even a generational one. Many people in senior positions today, they don't viscerally remember that constant fear of imminent nuclear annihilation.
Yeah.
The weapons were still there, of course, though numbers were vastly reduced by arms control treaties. But the prevailing belief was they wouldn't play a decisive strategic role, because no major country was determined enough to challenge America's leading position to the point of actually thinking about using them. So for a while, nukes sort of fell out of people's strategic imagination, became almost a relic of a bygone era. But now the terror is back with a vengeance. The risk that a confrontation with a rival great power, and we now have at least two, could produce a nuclear exchange. That's no longer some theoretical concern. It's a direct threat to the United States itself. The war in Ukraine has been a stark clarifier, a brutal reminder. It's revealed the continuing significance, the new significance, and the different significance of nuclear weapons in the post-Cold War world. Russia's explicit and implicit nuclear threats have forced the world, especially the U.S., to re-engage with this grim reality. It underscores these weapons aren't just for deterrence. They're active instruments of coercion and great power competition. That comfortable illusion of a world without nuclear risk. Shattered.
Okay, so if this shift is happening, this move away from unipolarity, and it's not just about Trump, what's the concrete evidence? What shows that the U.S. is actually withdrawing from those leadership roles in Europe and the Pacific and effectively accepting a multipolar global order? Where are the actions, or maybe the inactions, that signal this profound change?
That's an excellent way to frame it. Actions, not just words. To understand this, we really need to look at the two main theaters: the Russian challenge to America's position in Europe and the Chinese challenge in East Asia. These challenges are profoundly significant because they directly contest America's fundamental claim to global leadership. That claim was based on the idea that the U.S. was the only great power with the right, the responsibility to uphold order everywhere, that no country had the right to exclude the U.S. from any part of the world.
The great powers want their own space, right?
Exactly. A defining characteristic of a great power is its claim to a sphere of influence, an area around its borders where it seeks to exclude other great powers. America itself knows this concept intimately. It asserted its own sphere over the Western Hemisphere with the Monroe Doctrine way back in 1823. Now, Russia and China are asserting similar rights in their near abroad. And the reason Professor White believes this marks the undeniable end of the U.S.-led unipolar order is simple. Both these challenges are succeeding, or at the very least, they are not being decisively reversed by the United States.
Let's take East Asia first then, China.
Okay, East Asia. Around 2010, maybe a bit earlier, China began to overtly challenge America's position as the leading power there, particularly in the South China Sea, and with its massive military modernization program. The U.S. was then faced with a clear choice: push back decisively to keep its top spot, or acquiesce, let China's regional dominance grow. What has the U.S. actually done? Well, in reality, it's talked a good game about pushing back.
We heard about the pivot to Asia.
Right. Obama's pivot in 2011, talking about being all in the region, then Biden's more recent rhetoric about winning the contest for the 21st century against China. Lots of strong words. But if you look at what America actually did, or maybe what it didn't do, the answer is just about nothing of real strategic significance to actually reverse China's games.
What about the military balance specifically?
Consider the military dimension. Back in 1996, the U.S. military position in Asia, especially at sea and in the air, was overwhelmingly strong compared to China. If war had broken out over Taiwan or something else, America just would have won in a week, maybe less. Since then, China's air and maritime capabilities have grown like that, gestures sharply upwards, fueled by incredible economic and technological growth and a very tight, focused strategy on countering U.S. power projection right in its immediate neighborhood. Meanwhile, America's position has demonstrably declined, gestures downwards relative to China. Why? Because it hasn't built up its own forces in the region to match.
I know.
U.S. political leaders simply haven't been prepared to go out and bluntly tell Americans that in order to preserve their position in East Asia, they must be willing to fight a war with China. Think about the contrast with the Cold War. Leaders then engineered a massive military buildup. They eloquently explained why it was necessary to the American people. They accepted the risk of war to contain the Soviet Union. Today, that lack of corresponding action behind the strong rhetoric, it signifies a quiet, de facto withdrawal.
And you see a similar pattern in Europe with Russia. Maybe different details, but the same underlying trend of U.S. retrenchment.
Exactly the same pattern, really. When Russia moved into Georgia in 2008, then brazenly annexed Crimea in 2014, and then, of course, the larger invasion of Ukraine more recently, what did America do?
Yeah.
Strong verbal condemnations, yes. Sanctions, yes. But crucially, it avoided bringing Ukraine into NATO. Nor did it substantially reinforce U.S. military forces in Europe in a truly decisive way. Those tiny little token forces, we're talking battalions, not divisions deployed to the Baltic states and Poland after 2014, they almost demonstrated not that America was serious, but that it wasn't serious about deterring further Russian aggression on the ground.
What did that signal then?
It signaled, crucially, that the United States was not prepared to go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine. Full stop. And if the U.S. wasn't willing to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty with direct military force, it couldn't really uphold that U.S.-led order in Europe when faced with such a direct challenge.
And the nuclear dimension plays out differently here, too.
Hugely differently. This brings us to what White calls a big asymmetry compared to the Cold War: nuclear blackmail. During the Cold War, somehow, the U.S. credibly convinced the Kremlin it would fight a nuclear war, even accepting devastating attacks on U.S. cities to prevent a Soviet push into Western Europe. There was a symmetry of resolve, a kind of shared willingness to risk catastrophe. Today, Russia can credibly threaten nuclear weapons in Ukraine because the U.S. will not retaliate with nuclear force. Washington knows, Moscow knows, that Ukraine does not matter enough for Washington to risk nuclear retaliation on American soil.
Is there evidence for that assessment?
We saw this play out towards late 2022. During those Ukrainian counteroffensives, the U.S. reportedly assessed there was maybe a 50% chance Putin would use tactical nuclear weapons. And remember Biden's statement back in 2021, America will not fight World War III in Ukraine. What did that mean? It explicitly signaled this lack of resolve, meaning he would not fight a nuclear war over Ukraine. This demonstrates a clear U.S. unwillingness to escalate to nuclear conflict for these interests, and that effectively cedes ground, accepting a revised security reality in Europe.
This brings us squarely back to Donald Trump. Many people will instinctively point to him as the architect of these shifts, this withdrawal. But Professor White suggests something deeper is at play. How does he position Trump's influence? Is he a primary driver, or maybe more of an accelerant, perhaps even just a reflection of deeper currents in American society?
Trump is undeniably important. You can't ignore him. But I firmly believe Professor White would argue he is not the principal driver of these fundamental shifts in America's global role. The underlying forces, they're much bigger. We're talking about profound shifts in the global distribution of wealth and power. The resurgence of great power ambition in places like Russia and China, whose national power has grown so much. However, Trump's own consistent America First isolationism is a significant reinforcing factor. Absolutely. He is consistently, going way back to his public statements about U.S. allies in the 1980s, believe that the rest of the world doesn't matter that much to the United States, at least not in a direct security guaranteeing sense.
And his personality plays into this.
It seems to. And look, it's always tricky making strategic judgments purely on psychology, but two aspects of Trump's worldview seem particularly relevant here. Firstly, he doesn't like dependence, he doesn't like allies, he doesn't like weak people. That's pretty clear. But interestingly, he quite likes strong people. Think Putin, think Xi. This means he's much more willing than previous American leaders to accept other great powers as co-equals with the United States.
And the flip side.
And on the flip side, he's very ready to reject the idea that America should take responsibility for defending a whole lot of what he would see as mendicant allies. Allies who, in his view, can't or won't defend themselves properly. So his attitudes almost coincidentally, so to speak, fit the strategic imperatives that America faces at the moment. They align with a less interventionist, less globally responsible posture that the underlying power shifts are pushing America towards anyway.
And you mentioned deeper currents. Does Trump tap into something in the American public?
The second, and maybe more profound point, is that Trump's thinking deeply fits with what most Americans think, particularly outside the Washington Beltway. Think about it. Washington elites were thrilled to be the new Rome, to lead the world. Understandably so, right? It offered prestige, influence, but they sold this leadership role to the American people on the promise that it would be cheap and easy. Yet even the relatively small, cheap wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, which dragged on for years and cost trillions, they convinced many Americans outside the Beltway that it was absolutely not cheap and easy.
So if those wars were too much.
Exactly. If those are too much, they clearly don't want to contemplate a full-scale conventional war with China or Russia, let alone a nuclear exchange. So the idea of U.S. global leadership, which remains this kind of uncontestable truth for the orthodox political classes in Washington, is actually highly contestable, indeed unsustainable, for both Donald Trump and what Professor White argues is the vast majority of American voters.
And his electoral success reflects that.
Look at the numbers. Trump's vote increased in over 50% of counties, 3 times in a row in various elections. That underscores this point. It indicates that the president, quote, who doesn't want to accept the burdens of American global leadership, is fine by them. The public is okay with it. And the underlying reason for this shift in public opinion, it seems to Professor White, goes back to that lack of justification. Unlike the Cold War, where leaders like Kennedy explained with great clarity, great urgency, why extraordinary burdens, including risking American cities, were necessary to contain the Soviet Union, current U.S. political leaders, they have not explained to American people why they need to bear these burdens and carry these costs of global primacy today. They just assumed the burdens would stay light. But as they've grown, the credibility of that initial promise has just dropped away, leading to public fatigue and desire for retrenchment.
That's a fascinating link. Leaders' personality, public opinion, strategic reality, all pushing the same way. So, if Trump embodies this shift, what about the current administration, the one you call the old U.S. foreign policy establishment? Are they actively accepting the shift to multipolarity, or are they still fighting it? Are they beginning to get real, as Professor White puts it?
Well, look, Donald Trump himself isn't exactly a great theorist of international relations, is he? He doesn't explicitly use the specific language of multipolarity, but his rhetoric, his behavior, it strongly presupposes that's the way he sees things, a world where other powerful nations assert their interests, and the U.S. isn't solely responsible for everything. What's truly telling, though, is the shift you see in figures like Marco Rubio. Yes. As Secretary of State, in the source Professor White uses, Rubio has spoken very explicitly about accepting America as one pole in a multipolar global order. Now, this is a very significant shift for him. Given his past as a pretty orthodox advocate for continued U.S. global leadership interventionism, it indicates there's a serious intellectual current bubbling beneath the surface of the typical political drama in Washington. A recognition that the current U.S. policy, which is basically talking about preserving global leadership while failing to act on the other in terms of military buildup or willingness to fight, is unsustainable.
The talk and the walk don't match.
Exactly. They're beginning to realize that this discrepancy is catching up with them, and a different narrative is needed, one that Rubio is starting to articulate, and which, importantly, meshes with the way Trump conducts himself. It reveals a broader, maybe even bipartisan, reckoning with this new reality.
Trump often frames alliances in terms of the U.S. being ripped off. That's a common refrain. But critics argue the U.S. gets significant value from its alliances. Economic benefits, attracting top talent, tech transfer, military assistance, shared intelligence. Does he, or the movement he represents, truly underestimate these benefits? Or is there a different way to look at that ripped-off argument?
Professor White offers a rather stark reframing of that argument. The counter-argument that America would get all of those benefits anyway, even without providing security guarantees, is pretty compelling to him. For example, are foreign students from allied countries going to stop coming to the U.S. for its world-class education just because the security guarantee is gone? Probably not. Will brilliant minds stop working in Silicon Valley? Unlikely. These are independent attractions.
So where does the ripped-off part come in?
The problem, as Professor White sees it, is this. If allies continue to depend on the United States for their defense, when preserving that position now costs America real money and real risk, including, remember, the risk of nuclear war for interests far from home, then they are ripping America off. Why, he asks, should America defend Japan or Europe when they clearly have the economic and technological capacity to defend themselves, even if it's costly for them? The argument shifts from looking at historical benefits to the current, arguably unsustainable cost-benefit analysis for the U.S.
But can allies even imagine a world without the U.S. alliance structure? It's been the foundation for so long.
That's true. For many U.S. allies, the alliance has so completely framed their relationship with the United States that they find it incredibly hard to imagine what a non-alliance relationship would even look like. It's almost an existential dependence for some. But history offers examples. Look at Australia's relationship with Britain. After the UK stopped guaranteeing Australia's security post-World War II, very big and important and beneficial bilateral relations continued quite robustly. In fact, Professor White suggests ending security guarantees could even remove a structural irritant. If the U.S. stops spending billions of dollars to provide security for those countries that they could provide for themselves, maybe the relationship becomes healthier.
Healthier how?
Based more on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than a kind of patron-client dynamic. The U.S. might even gain respect for allies who finally take full responsibility for their own defense. It's a challenging thought for many, I know, but it aligns with that more realist perspective on international relations.
Okay, let's delve deeper into this economic power balance, especially with this peak China narrative that's been circulating lately, suggesting China's economic rise is slowing, maybe even reversing. Does China's slowing growth give the U.S. more breathing room, more hope of retaining its dominant position? Or is that a miscalculation?
That's a crucial question. And it's a narrative that, certainly in the West, has often served to, well, reassure U.S. leadership. Reassure them that they can win this contest without paying the true costs or making the really difficult strategic choices. Now, is it true that China will never grow at 10% per annum again? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. No country does after its initial huge industrialization boom, especially not at China's scale. But here's the key point. It doesn't have to grow that fast for its strategic weight to remain immense. Even if China's economy were to flatline today, just stop growing entirely, it would still be far more powerful relative to the United States than any country has been since America overtook Britain way back in the late 1880s. The costs and risks of challenging China, even a non-growing China, would still be far, far higher than Washington previously seemed to believe.
And how we measure economic power matters here too, right?
Hugely important. We need to remember that in purchasing power parity, PPP terms, which is really the relevant measure for strategic affairs, because it reflects the actual buying power within an economy. China's economy has been bigger than America's for a whole decade. It's not going to suddenly fall back significantly in real terms. This peak China idea suggesting some rapid decline is probably unrealistic. No large economy has ever really done that. The fundamental reality we have to confront, and we in the West find this extraordinarily hard to get our heads around, maybe we cling to older metrics like nominal GDP, is that the United States no longer has the biggest economy in the world in the most strategically meaningful way. That's the truth.
And we've underestimated China before.
Consistently. The West has consistently underestimated what China could achieve ever since its economic reforms kicked off back in 1979. So basing any strategic policy on the expectation that China will somehow be less strong relative to the U.S. in the future, that would be the height of folly. It's far more prudent, from a realist standpoint, to expect it to be even stronger.
Especially in technology.
Particularly in technology, yes. China has moved from being primarily a technology taker to being the technology creator much faster than anyone expected. That old idea of China as just a dumb economy doing low-end manufacturing, profoundly outdated. China has expanded tertiary education faster earlier than other developing countries did, And on present trends, it will dominate key technologies in the future, especially in areas like AI, quantum, advanced manufacturing. This tech prowess, combined with China's much larger manufacturing share in its GDP compared to the service-heavy U.S. economy, it positions China extremely well for hard military power. Because strategic rivalry, at the end of the day, is a very physical thing. It depends on industrial capacity, innovation. This asymmetry isn't just economic, it's fundamentally military.
So China's economic and tech might really alters the strategic equation. You also highlight a profound asymmetry in the strategic competition between the US and China, especially regarding military capabilities. Could you elaborate on why this makes it an overwhelmingly uphill battle for the US to keep its military edge in Asia? And how does this play into Professor White's argument for withdrawal?
Absolutely. The strategic competition between the U.S. and China, particularly in East Asia, is profoundly asymmetrical, deeply so. The United States, at least conceptually, sort of pretends to itself that it's trying to preserve a global military predominance, the ability to project power anywhere, everywhere. China, by contrast, it's only trying to do is to stop America achieving that predominance in its own backyard, within its immediate sphere of influence. This gives China significant inherent advantages.
Such
Well, firstly, location. Obvious, but crucial. China operates from home bases, benefiting from short supply lines, robust local support. The U.S., it has to project power over vast distances, thousands of miles across the Pacific. That requires extensive and, frankly, vulnerable logistics chains. Secondly, focus. China can concentrate all its military and technological efforts right close to home. It directs its massive resources to develop very specific anti-accessory denial capabilities, A2AD designed precisely to push U.S. forces away from its shores. America, conversely, has global commitments. Its resources are necessarily dispersed all over the world.
And technology favors the defense now.
That's the third point. There's a very big operational advantage. Due to current trends in military technology, especially things like precision missiles and advanced sensors, put simply, it's a lot harder to project power by sea and air than it is to stop someone projecting power by sea and air. The balance overwhelmingly favors the defensive side right now. Offensive operations, particularly things like amphibious landings or large-scale air campaigns against a defended coast, they're becoming exponentially riskier, more costly, against a determined, technologically advanced defender like China.
And the final asymmetry.
Lastly, and maybe most crucially, China just cares more. The balance of resolve favors China in East Asia, just like it favors Russia in Ukraine. For China, maintaining control over areas it considers sovereign, like Taiwan, or asserting its regional dominance, that's a core national interest, maybe even an existential one for the Communist Party's legitimacy. For the U.S., while East Asia is important, maintaining dominance there isn't seen as an existential threat to the American homeland itself. So these four asymmetries, all favoring China, mean that even if the U.S. could somehow overcome China's material power advantage, it would still face an overwhelmingly uphill battle to maintain its current position. And from Professor White's perspective, there's simply no imperative to do so for America's core security interests. He argues the U.S. can live a perfectly prosperous and secure life without being the dominant military power in East Asia.
Now, this analysis sounds very much aligned with a realist school of thought. Like John Mearsheimer's idea that rising powers inevitably clash with established powers, often leading to conflict. But you seem to diverge from Mearsheimer's ultimate conclusion that the U.S. will try to remain dominant and will fight. Where does your analysis and Professor White specifically part ways with that view?
It's a key point of divergence, yes. Despite my very high regard for Mearsheimer's work and the profound insights of realist theory generally, at the heart of his thinking is this historically, determinist idea. As a rising power meets an established power, the established power inevitably tries to preserve their position, and that friction leads to war. And history certainly offers many compelling examples of that pattern. Graham Allison's Thucydides trap idea identifies, 12 out of 16 such cases leading to conflict? It's a powerful historical analogy.
But not inevitable.
But Professor White, and I agree with him here, firmly believes that nothing in human affairs is inevitable. Nothing. Confronted with a challenge like China's rise, the U.S. basically has three choices. It can resist, which, yes, would likely lead to war. It can do a deal, meet halfway, negotiate a new equilibrium, accept spheres of influence, or it can cave in, essentially accepting China's regional primacy. Professor White believes America is, by its actions much more than its rhetoric, actually choosing to step back to avoid war.
Choosing to step back, despite the tough talk.
Despite the strong rhetoric, exactly. Like Joe Biden repeatedly pledging to defend Taiwan. America is simply not taking the steps that were necessary to push back with a truly decisive military buildup, or demonstrating a clear willingness to actually fight that war. When historians look back at this period 50 years from now, they will say that America was already withdrawing. Why? Because its actions just didn't match its words. And if America isn't truly serious about preserving its leading position in East Asia to the point of risking a major war, then war won't happen, at least not as a result of a direct U.S. challenge to China's rise.
But accidents can happen.
However, this is a big caution. War could still break out by mistake or through miscalculation. If the U.S. in a crisis makes a wrong decision, despite the underlying logic pushing it to step back and de-escalate, it could still stumble into a war it doesn't really want and isn't prepared for. There's a significant risk there. And frankly, I lack confidence in either Trump's or Biden's capacity to make the absolute right call at 3 in the morning in some high-stakes, rapidly escalating scenario over Taiwan or the South China Sea.
Okay, so if the U.S. is indeed stepping back, consciously or not, what should its erstwhile allies do? The strategic ground is shifting beneath their feet. Can they become unaligned middle powers, trying to balance between the great powers? Or do they need to pursue more radical options?
That middle power strategy, that's a very important possibility, and it's one that many countries, especially those situated on those geopolitical dividing lines, will likely have to adopt as a core strategic adjustment. Take Japan, for instance. It can no longer rely in the long term on America to underwrite Japan's security against a rising China. That guarantee is fading. The good news for Japan, it has the inherent capacity, economic, technological, even demographic, despite its aging challenges to preserve its independence vis-a-vis China. Japan is very defendable, geographically speaking, and has advanced military capabilities.
But does it need something more?
Professor White argues, yes, it will need its own nuclear weapons, which he notes is technically trivial for Japan, given their advanced civilian nuclear program. With that capability, Japan could potentially play Russia and China off against one another more effectively. Now, Japan isn't strong enough to lead some regional coalition to directly resist China's primacy, nor is there really enough trust for that across Asia, given Japan's history. So, its most practical option: be a strategically independent middle power, focusing on robust self-defense, possibly with a nuclear backstop.
What about Australia? You called them the most alliance-oriented people.
Australia. Yes, arguably the most alliance-oriented people in the universe, historically clinging to that U.S. alliance as their primary, almost only, security guarantor. Australia needs to stop presuming the U.S. will just manage its China problem for them. That era is ending. Instead, it must prepare to defend itself independently. That means spending significantly more on defense, building a force genuinely structured for self-defense, leveraging its unique island geography and that vast maritime environment. Interestingly, the same asymmetries that favor China over the U.S. in its near seas, they now favor Australia against China in its immediate approaches. Defense has the advantage.
And diplomatically.
Diplomatically, Australia should rethink its positioning. Aim to be as equidistantly as possible between India and China. Don't get locked into one side, maintain maximum flexibility. And it needs to work much more closely with its Southeast Asian neighbors, especially Indonesia, which is projected to be the fourth biggest economy globally by 2040 or so, and a future great power in its own right. Build regional security partnerships there.
Okay, let's turn to Taiwan. It seems to be in an incredibly precarious position, caught right in the crosshairs. Is there anything truly meaningful Taiwan can do to secure its future? Or is its fate largely sealed by these bigger geopolitical shifts?
Taiwan is a very difficult case. Extremely difficult, because China is just so strong and so determined on unification. You're talking 24 million people against 1.3 billion. And while the Taiwan Strait offers some defensive advantage, it is simply not wide enough to truly insulate the island from Chinese pressure, especially military pressure. Plus, Taiwan has historically spent so little on defense, around 1.5%, maybe now nudging up towards 2% of GDP. This, despite being in what Professor White calls a 10% predicament, meaning given the threat, it should be spending something closer to 10% like Israel to be truly serious about self-defense.
What about the porcupine strategy, making invasion too costly?
The porcupine strategy, making invasion incredibly difficult and costly for the attacker, is a valid small power tactic, no doubt. But for Taiwan, Professor White argues it simply can't raise the costs and risks high enough in view of China's imperative and its overwhelming capabilities. China likely believes it can absorb those costs if it has to. Moreover, he argues invasion isn't even China's most probable operational option. Taiwan is, frankly, tailor-made for blockade. That would be far less costly in blood and treasure for China. and an easier way to exert control, slowly strangling the island without a direct, bloody military assault.
So what's the takeaway for the West regarding Taiwan?
The challenge for the West, then, is how honest are we being with Taiwan? Professor White feels it's very improper to encourage Taiwan to expect aid and intervention if the U.S. ultimately won't provide it at the scale required for a full-scale conflict against China. Honesty is needed, he argues, so Taiwan can manage their relations with China accordingly, make its own difficult choices about its future based on reality, not false hope. Donald Trump, at least, has been relatively unambiguous about his lack of support for Taiwan in a military conflict. So Taipei under Trump might be under fewer illusions than those who still cling to the idea of American strategic ambiguity, meaning certain intervention.
And what about the critical chips argument? Taiwan makes what, 70–90% of the world's most cutting-edge AI chips? Doesn't that make it strategically vital? A global choke point the U.S. must defend.
That's a critical point, yes, and it's often debated. Taiwan's achievement in chip manufacturing, especially through TSMC, is truly remarkable. Globally indispensable today, no question. But Professor White presents a grim, yet strategically cold, calculation here. He suggests the smart thing for the U.S. in an extreme scenario of an imminent Chinese takeover might not be to defend Taiwan by fighting a war, but rather to destroy the fabs, to intentionally demolish those chip manufacturing facilities.
Destroy them.
It's a profoundly difficult, ethically fraught proposition. Horrible to contemplate, but militarily. It's arguably easier, less costly for the U.S. than fighting a full-scale, likely nuclear war with China over the island. Furthermore, denying China those chips by destroying the fabs, it will likely only be a very temporary victory. China is already expanding its own indigenous chip capabilities at breakneck speed, partly in response to previous U.S. export controls. They might not match TSMC tomorrow, but they're investing massively to close that gap.
So it comes down to cost versus benefit again.
It always does in strategy. The fundamental calculation for the U.S. comes down to weighing the benefits of temporarily denying China these specific chips against the immense, potentially existential costs of fighting that war. This isn't a war the U.S. is likely to win conventionally against China in its own backyard, and it would almost certainly risk escalating to a nuclear exchange, risking American cities and wars. The question becomes stark. Is this worth risking nuclear attack on American cities? In the 3.0 AM crisis, Professor White profoundly doubts an American president would prioritize global chip supply over avoiding nuclear devastation on the U.S. homeland. It just highlights the strategic vulnerability of relying so heavily on a single point of failure in such a contested region.
That's a sobering, truly difficult thought experiment. Let's move across the water to South Korea. Their situation is unique, isn't it? Given North Korea's growing nuclear capabilities and its direct threat now to the U.S. mainland, how does this shift in U.S. willingness to bear costs affect their security? What are their likely responses?
South Korea is indeed in a very, very precarious position. Highly vulnerable to North Korean nuclear blackmail. That's the key phrase. Why? Because North Korea now possesses a growing arsenal of nuclear weapons and increasingly sophisticated ICBMs. ICBMs with a credible capability to place them on American cities. This dramatically undermines the credibility of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence, that core security guarantee that the U.S. would use nuclear weapons to defend South Korea if attacked.
Why does North Korea hitting the U.S. change the guarantee for South Korea?
Because in the past, if North Korea attacked the South, the U.S. could threaten or use nuclear force in response without fearing direct nuclear retaliation on its own homeland. Now, it's barely credible, White argues, that the U.S. would launch a nuclear attack against North Korea in response to an attack on the South, knowing it could risk San Francisco, Los Angeles, or other American cities in return. South Koreans understand this implicitly. They see the strategic logic. They've sought deeper reassurances from Washington about U.S. extended nuclear deterrence, but the U.S. has essentially sent them away empty-handed. Washington can't credibly give the ironclad guarantee Seoul wants without accepting an unacceptable level of risk to itself. As a result, confidence in U.S. protection has fallen very sharply among the South Korean public and its elite.
So what's the likely outcome?
Professor White believes, quite starkly, that South Korea will probably acquire its own nuclear capability. It feels it has no other choice for survival. This would potentially make it the first respectable country, as he puts it, to break the non-proliferation structure established by the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that foundational global agreement designed to stop the spread of nukes. Now, this move, while understandable from South Korea's perspective as a matter of national survival, would almost certainly destroy the U.S.-South Korea alliance as we know it. And it would put extraordinary pressure on Japan to follow suit, which could fundamentally reshape the security landscape in Northeast Asia, potentially triggering a dangerous regional nuclear arms race.
A cascade effect. Finally, let's turn to Europe. You sounded, maybe surprisingly, a bit optimistic earlier. You suggested Europe has the potential for a collective response and could cohere strategically as a great power. Is that realistic, given Europe's history of this unity? And what would it actually take for Europe to achieve this strategic autonomy?
I am, yes, perhaps uncharacteristically optimistic about Europe in this specific regard. Professor White believes a cohesive Europe acting strategically as a great power is actually the best outcome for Europe itself. It allows Europe to control its own destiny rather than be dependent. And simultaneously, it would be a stabilizing factor for the world, a third major pole of power alongside the US and China-Russia. But, and it's a big but, this would require Europe to act together strategically in a way that it never has before. That implies a profound political transformation, moving way beyond just economic or institutional cooperation.
What factors might help Europe achieve this?
Several factors do favor it. Europe's geographical compactness makes mutual security dependence obvious, immediate. For instance, Germany and Poland's security are just inextricably linked when it comes to Russia's actions. You can't separate them. They also have an extraordinary history of cooperation within existing frameworks like NATO and the EU. That offers a strong institutional base to build upon for deeper integration.
And does Europe have the raw power?
Absolutely. Europe is easily strong enough to stand up to Russia on a conventional level. Its combined economy is 10 times Russia's economy. Its combined militaries have 2-3 times its tanks and planes. Well, current defense spending is low, around 1.5% of GDP, maybe nudging towards 2%. Now, Europe can certainly afford to increase it to maybe 3% of GDP, which Professor White estimates would be sufficient for a robust conventional defense against Russia.
What's the biggest hurdle then?
The major challenge, however, is the nuclear question. How do Europeans credibly deter Russia on their own? France and Britain possess nuclear weapons, sure, but no one really believes that Paris or London would risk nuclear war with Moscow to defend, say, Estonia, or maybe even Poland. The credibility just isn't there for extended deterrence within Europe. Europe must decide where it is going to draw that line to stop Russia. Poland's clearly critical. It's the road to Germany. Defending that line requires absolute determination and very substantial conventional forces that can actually fight and win a high-intensity land war.
Could Europe create its own nuclear deterrent?
Ideally, Professor White is optimistic, maybe cautiously so, that Europe might create a cohesive European strategic identity which can credibly use nuclear weapons collectively, controlled somehow by a European political authority. Now, that is a horrifically tall order. Think about it. Requiring France and Britain to effectively cede sovereign control over their ultimate deterrence to some collective European body. Extremely difficult politically. But he argues it's probably preferable to individual proliferation like Poland debating getting its own nukes, which would likely just fragment European security further.
As technologically,
Yeah.
militarily.
Beyond nukes, Europe also needs to go indigenous in military technology, produce its own first-order, fifth-generation fighter aircraft, for example, or excel in areas like advanced missiles and drones. Rely less on U.S. tech. This means a strategic shift, moving away from trying to be global powers with expeditionary forces, aircraft carriers, things like that, toward becoming old-fashioned continental powers, focused squarely on continental warfare. Avoiding, as White puts it, stupid things like aircraft carriers for countries like Britain or France, whose naval power should be focused closer to home, protecting Europe's maritime approaches.
So despite the initial reluctance we might see from many countries to fully shoulder the burdens of their own defense, you sound generally hopeful that they will ultimately rise to this challenge in this new multipolar world.
Yes, I do, ultimately. In a weird way, as I think White puts it, Donald Trump have actually done us a favor. His dramatic, blunt stepping back from America's traditional security role has made it much harder to pretend to ourselves, meaning U.S. allies, that they can just keep depending on America in the same old way. It's forced an undeniable confrontation with reality, a realization that the security environment has fundamentally changed and they must adapt. That shock, though jarring, might be precisely what's needed for these nations to finally embrace true strategic autonomy.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to a different but potentially decisive strategic technology, AI, artificial general intelligence, AGI. There's this narrative of a race going on where the U.S. aims to achieve AGI first so it can basically dictate terms to China. What's your take on this geopolitical strategy within the framework we've been discussing?
This is a significant set of issues, absolutely. And I approach with caution, as I think Professor White does too. Do I buy the argument that this could be radically and quite rapidly transformational? Yes, I do. Potentially comparable to the Industrial Revolution, just maybe on a much faster timescale. However, it's still really unclear how precisely it affects the evolution of warfare. While we imagine these immediate radical changes, history shows that even revolutionary military technologies think tanks, aircraft took decades to truly reshape military doctrine and strategy, much slower than the tech itself developed. This suggests that even transformative AI might face similar integration challenges into strategic reality. Maybe it influences intelligence, logistics, cyber warfare more immediately than, say, direct combat outcomes. We just don't know yet.
And can the U.S. maintain an edge in AI?
More importantly, I'm very cautious about presuming that America can preserve, let alone expand its edge over China in this AI race. As we discussed, the West has consistently underestimated China every step of the way in its technological and economic development. So a healthy dose of methodological caution is necessary here. Don't assume U.S. dominance.
But strategically, if the U.S. did get AGI first?
Ultimately, the question in strategic terms always comes back to the mutual capacity to impose damage, and crucially about neutralizing the other side's ultimate deterrence. Even if AGI significantly enhances America's capacity to inflict damage on China, it probably won't deprive China of the capacity to impose huge damage on the United States.
Yeah.
China, with its boring old nuclear weapons, its existing arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles, can still kill 50 million Americans in an afternoon. Unless AGI can somehow magically neutralize Chinese nuclear weapons, render them obsolete or ineffective, which seems highly unlikely anytime soon, the U.S. simply cannot truly dictate to China. The nuclear stalemate remains.
And the resolve issue comes back too.
And the asymmetry of resolve persists. Exactly. The stakes are just fundamentally higher for China in East Asia than they are for the U.S. homeland. Why should the U.S. risk a nuclear exchange to maintain regional hegemony when it could live a perfectly comfortable life without it? Finally, I deeply doubt the U.S. political system's capacity for the kind of sustained, focused, Manhattan Project-style focus needed to achieve these grand AGI-driven strategic goals anyway. Despite all the bipartisan tough talk on China, you don't hear any leader talking about the true costs and risks involved, like explicitly risking U.S. cities, the way Cold War leaders like Kennedy did over Berlin in 1961. He explicitly stated a willingness to risk U.S. cities to defend West Berlin. Till you see that level of explicit, costly, difficult commitment from U.S. leaders today, the grand strategic aims linked to winning some AI race seem questionable in their real-world applicability to coercive diplomacy.
Your analysis, reflecting Professor White's, clearly has a very distinct realist flavor. It focuses relentlessly on power, security, national interest. You mentioned you're not a capital R realist in the academic sense, but how much of this perspective comes from looking at empirical evidence, historical patterns, versus maybe a more intuitive gestalt impression of how nations behave under pressure? And what are the difficult truths this little realism, as you call it, forces us to confront?
It definitely has a realistic flavor, yes, and that's quite intentional.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not much of a theory guy in the academic sense. My approach really originated very practically from working in government for many years and looking at what countries did and working out why they were doing it, trying to understand the motivations behind the actions. Now, I absolutely acknowledge that realism doesn't offer a complete explanation for all state behavior. Countries cooperate for mutual good all the time. Think trade agreements, climate accords, organizations like the EU or ASEAN. That's not pure realism. But I do believe that when armed force comes into the picture, when the threat of war or the actual use of force is on the table, the explanations for state behavior become overwhelmingly realist, almost entirely.
Why is that?
Because the costs and risks of war are just so incredibly high. The potential for human suffering, economic devastation, it's immense. So the stakes has to be very high. It goes right to those very fundamental questions about national survival and core security interests. Just that. So my realism, this little realism, is the realism of asking, what's the real cost and risk involved in these things? It's about taking the possibility of war more seriously and having weighed the costs of war more seriously when making policy decisions. For instance, concluding that Taiwan is essentially indefensible for the U.S. without risking nuclear war. That's a very horrible conclusion to draw. Many people find it deeply offensive, I understand that. But it forces us to acknowledge the real costs, the potential scale of such a conflict. A war over Taiwan, it would likely be larger than any war since the Second World War, and, as White suggests, probably the worst war in history because it would probably go nuclear. You simply can't seriously discuss these life and death questions or commit a nation's blood and treasure without soberly, brutally considering those immense potential costs.
It sounds like The realism of limits, almost.
Exactly. As Bismarck famously said, politics is the art of the possible. But the less quoted part of that is, it's the art of the next best. Unipolarity, as we discussed, yeah, it's lovely. A comfortable, beneficial period for the U.S. and its allies, no doubt. However, the genuine cost of trying to preserve that in the face of the actual challenges we face now from nuclear-armed great powers like China and Russia, the cost justifies that. We now have to settle for the next best thing, a multipolar order. So our focus should be on building that multipolar order and making it work, making it as stable, as cooperative as possible, given the inherent rivalries. And when you look at history, really look at it, major wars are overwhelmingly driven by concern for their own security, not purely by moral purposes. The American Civil War is perhaps the best, maybe the only major exception, a war fought primarily for moral ends by the North against slavery. But most other major wars, even the religious wars, the wars of conquest, they usually had underlying dynastic or security interests driving them, whatever the lofty rhetoric might have suggested. This historical pattern strongly suggests that national survival, not abstract ideals, will continue to be the primary motivator for great powers in this tough new world.
That's a powerful and admittedly quite clear-eyed perspective. It really forces us to reevaluate some deeply held assumptions. So, wrapping this up, if you had a core message for people inside the U.S. government and maybe separately for American voters across the country about this new reality Professor White outlines, what would it be? What are the key takeaways you'd want them to internalize?
I think I have a slightly different message for three distinct groups tailored to their role in this evolving landscape. Firstly, to American voters, to the citizens of the United States. I would say this: your country doesn't need to hang on to global leadership in order to be the country you want it to be. You can still be prosperous, secure, and influential without being the sole superpower. In fact, trying to hang on to global leadership would be a disaster for the United States. It risks incredibly costly, probably unwinnable wars and diverts precious resources from domestic needs. What America needs to be now is a very powerful member of a global multipolar order, and it can still do great things by using its considerable power wisely, cooperatively within that framework, focusing on its core interests and living up to its values.
Okay, message one. Let go of primacy. Embrace powerful membership. What about the Trump administration or similar future ones?
To the Trump administration or any future administration that embraces similar America First kind of instincts, I'd say, for God's sake, do what you can. Since you implicitly, or maybe explicitly, accept that it's going to be a multipolar order, well then, help build that multipolar order, contribute to its stability, and recognize that building it will require you to cooperate with others, not simply withdraw into a resentful isolation. Real leadership in a multipolar world means working pragmatically with other major powers, even rivals, to manage global challenges.
And finally, the old establishment.
And finally, for what Professor White sees as maybe the most problematic group right now, the old U.S. foreign policy establishment, the Bidens, the Sullivans, the Blinkens, those who still seem to cherish that unipolar moment of the 1990s. My message, echoing White, is blunt. Let it go. Stop kidding yourself. Stop talking as if you're serious about preserving U.S. primacy and doing nothing about it in terms of the necessary military buildup or demonstrating a real willingness to fight those wars. That approach, talking tough but not backing it up, is extremely dangerous. Why? Because it provokes without deterring. You're signaling ambition without demonstrating capability or resolve, which is just a recipe for miscalculation by rivals. The biggest problem, in Professor White's view, is that this establishment is still in love with the vision of leading the world that seemed to beckon to them in the 1990s. So my advice to them is simple. Let it go. Get real. The world has changed, and U.S. policy must change with it.
Professor Hugh White's insights certainly offer a stark yet compelling vision of the future global landscape. He's urging us to confront difficult realities rather than cling to past illusions. Understanding these shifts feels absolutely crucial for navigating the complex world ahead.
And recognizing these realities, however uncomfortable, allows us to make more informed choices, doesn't it? Moving forward with clear eyes about both the immense costs and, perhaps, the hidden opportunities in this emerging multipolar order.
Thank you all for your time and participation in this exploration of global power today. Please do like, share, and subscribe to Global WarWatch Network for more in-depth analyses like this one.
And we genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspectives in the comment section below and join us on social media. All the links are provided right there in the description.